Hi, Another Watch fans, and welcome to another Audicle analysis episode with Alon, David, and me, and we're going to discuss David's most recent Audicle, the controversially titled Vintage Watches Are Bullshit. I like the succinctness of it, David. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's been a while, but always great to be back talking to you too.
Same, and I really enjoyed listening to your first self-recorded Audicle also, so thank you for doing that, taking something off my plate, and I thought you did a smashing job. And it was nice to hear your words said exactly as they were intended. And now we're going to chop them up together. But for anyone that hasn't listened to the Audicle or has forgotten exactly what was said in last week's episode, David, perhaps you could give us a quick recap of what we meant by vintage watches are bullshit.
All right. So I have been very into watches for a long time. Not as long as, certainly you two or some in the audience, but well over 10 years now. And in that time, there's been a couple of things that that have never really sat quite right with me. And the astronomical valuations for certain vintage watches and just the overvaluations for others have just never made sense. Never made sense at all to me when you look at them on the merits. And we can go through some of those reasons, as we go through the show. But I think in the same way that certain people out there are calling bullshit on the price for some of the modern hype watches, it just seemed right to me that we could do the same with vintage watches. They're treated as kind of this, phenomenal category where you have to respect it and never say anything bad. But to me, the facts just don't say that. And so I'm looking forward to discussing that with you and Alan today.
Thank you, David. I agree totally with Rob. It was very nice to hear you read out your own article as an Audicle. And I love the American accent. I like your British accent as well, Rob, but it's nice to have a proper American, a proper British, and me half mesh in between. David, you ruffled my feathers again with your title. Oh my gosh, here he comes again. This is going to be bashing on air. You saved yourself with a ton of disclaimers when you kicked off the article and therefore the Audicle. But I'm going to take a stance. Vintage is definitely not BS. And before I dive in why I think so, maybe let's do a fun game. It seems that vintage, strangely enough, is a subjective definition, or it's framed or coined time-wise differently by everyone. So I'm very curious how you two define vintage in general, because I have a very simple rule. Everything that's 25 years old on the day that you decide what's vintage, that's vintage. And everything that's 100 years old is antique. C'est tout. What do you guys think?
That's a super interesting question. And I'm really interested to hear your answer, because the first part, the 25-year limit, I had heard of. The 100-year, not so much. It makes total sense. But I want to kind of talk around that a little bit. So I think the word vintage has certain connotations, which I talk about in the article. We can come back later to. But just with regards to the age, when a vintage watch is sold as vintage, my kind of qualitative assessment is that really you're talking about a very specific period, really like the 1950s to the end of the 1960s. It's kind of that Mad Men era of design. I mean, that to me is what I think of when I think of vintage. The trouble I have with that 25-year period is that, we're moving on in years. And so you talk less than 25 or 25 years, you're talking the year 2000. That to me is like a neo-vintage or even just a used watch, which I have no problem shopping. And I think there's phenomenal bargains to be had there. So when I'm talking about vintage watches, I think my mind is very specifically going to that period of design, the 20 years or so, that seems to be generating so much of the attention when we talk about vintage watches going for crazy prices, like, the big Crown Submariners, the Omegas, et cetera, et cetera.
So that's really interesting. Okay, so I'm going to try and work through what both of you said. I'll start with the easy point, and that's antique. So I think that what Alon said, anything over 100 years old is antique, is just the definition of antique. I believe that's pretty widely accepted. I don't know if it's official in any way, but that's what I've always thought about anything, like an antique chair or an antique table. I would say if it's under 100 years old, It's not an antique. If it's over, then it is. So vintage. I like Alan's definition because it accepts the fact that we are always moving forward. And obviously, new things are going to be regarded as vintage. To your point, David, about that 25-year bracket not being quite far enough back, I suppose the watches that fall into that definition now, so something from like 1998, which would be the youngest vintage watch available by Alan's definition, I'd say maybe they are more often retro in my mind, or pre-loved, secondhand, old watches, whatever. You define vintage as a specific window of style. That I find odd, because that means that, according to your definition, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but this is how I interpret what you said, there'll never be new vintage watches. Old watches that don't fall within that 50s to 60s category will never become vintage by your definition, just because it's a stylistic thing. So there's one other way that I think that I could take what you said and apply it to a vintage definition, and maybe that is styles of watches that are no longer produced but aren't old enough to be antiques. So there could be some flexibility there in the time frame that these pieces are made within, and that could encapsulate them. So like jumbo models, for example, which aren't jumbo at all by modern standards, but the old 36, 37 millimeters when they first started creeping up to those diameters, that kind of watch doesn't exist on the modern market in the same way that it did in the 50s and the 60s. So I get what you're saying there, but you're basically saying that an Art Nouveau watch from 1935 is neither antique nor vintage. Now, I don't know what you think that is, but I would say that has to fall into one of those two categories, and I'm more comfortable putting that and all war watches like the Dirty Dozen, for example, into the vintage category also. Weirdly enough, my own personal definition of vintage is something I know is nonsensical, because it will also expire, like your definition will become more and more niche as time goes on. And I sort of think of anything pre-Quartz Crisis as vintage. That's my definition. So everything else after that, so like Swatch, to me, I love the term neo-vintage. I think that's great. I really think that that's something we could apply for like 1980 to 1998, and then everything beyond that is relatively modern. Or retro, for example. What do you think of that?
Very interesting. And this is exactly what I hoped you guys would all see, because that's what you see happening both on the consumer side and on the dealer side. And when you shift through websites or Chrono24 or eBay, when you look for vintage, because it is indeed very difficult. Antique in every profession is indeed 100 years is cut off or not, or makes it antique or not, because you have a gap of, let's say, in theory, 75 years. How do you categorize everything? So I totally feel you guys. We as vintage dealers and CPO dealers, we usually indeed categorize per decade, because for me, a chronomat from 1985, which I vividly remember when my dad got the first one in 85, to me, it's not a vintage watch, right? Because it kind of is young or a young timer. But if you think about it, it's almost soon 40 years old. So is that vintage or not? Is it neo-vintage? So super interesting. What do you think, David?
Yeah, so I just wanted to go back to a couple of things that you said, Rob. So we've been saying the word vintage, but really that word is actually pretty key to the whole premise of the Audicle, which is that, vintage is a subjective term. The objective term, when we're talking about a vintage watch, would just be used, and that applies to anything. But the word vintage, in my mind, is used to do a lot of heavy lifting, and I use that term in the Audicle to cover up a lot of things that make this an objectively, right, again, worse product than what you could buy new for the same amount of money. So we all know what goes with a vintage description, right? You've got patina, which, okay, that's great. Then you've got tropical dial, who knows what that means? Spider dial, where does that come from? Is that the effects of time, or is it because someone dropped the watch one too many times, right? So that really is key. This idea that vintage is a subjective term that is creating a lot of the bullshit around these types of watches. And the second point I just want to pick up on is this idea of condition, right? So, what is going to become vintage in 50 years? Like, will a watch from today be vintage? And actually, I think this is where a lot of the subtlety comes along, because watches today are so well made that you could almost say that whatever you buy today, provided you don't just, run it on the concrete, it's going to look the same. So then to me, that will just be a used watch, and you'll be buying it on the merits of what that watch is versus, some inflated story that you're getting just because it's a quote vintage piece.
Okay, I got another little wrinkle to add to that, and that comes down to the fact that watches weren't always collectible, and they weren't always sold as collectible items. They weren't ever sold as the idea of like an investment commodity or something. That's a very modern idea. The watches you're talking about, and I really do think that the 50s and 60s definition is too narrow. So if you'll forgive me for indulging my own definition, let's say pre-quartz crisis, up until like the First World War, is vintage. If you're saying that's going to remain the only cachet of vintage watches we have, I like that definition based on the fact that what comes after will not only be different materially, but also conceptually and commercially. Like the watches that have been sold since the quartz crisis have been sold as different types of products. They became emotional products following the watchmaking's existential crisis when quartz looked like it was going to put mechanical watchmaking in the grave. And it almost did, as we know. So I do see what you're saying. In 100 years' time, will something like a mass-produced Breitling Navitimer from 2023 have the same aura of a vintage watch that in this particular time in which we live is extolled because it should not still exist? That's the beauty of old watches. That's why they're valuable, and they're rare because they weren't meant to be kept as prestige items in pristine condition for so much of that time. So is that kind of part of what you're saying? Does that fit with your vision of it, David?
Yeah, and actually, so I'm totally fine. So we've talked about the vintage definition, and I think that if we expand out the time horizon to what you're talking about, Rob, so I basically expanded out backwards through time, I still think the argument holds, because the reason that I see all this bullshit is that you're using kind of basically a story to inflate the value. And so there's really kind of two things that come to mind here, two examples. One is pretty specific, the other one's more general. The specific one is there is a very well-known website, rhymes with Wolinki, and they published an article about a Submariner a few years back, which was going for just some absurd amount. I think it was like $2 million because some painter had owned it and the bezel was falling off. And somehow, because it had belonged to a painter, not a famous one, it was worthy of this price, which was just, and obviously, there were some actually rare things, like it was an Explorer dial, I think, and there were some rare issues with it. But like, to have that valuation, I just kind of rolled my eyes, and I still roll my eyes when I pull up that story. The other one is that, when we talk about stories used to sell vintage watches, so Rob, you brought up the Dirty Dozen, right? So those clearly have an extremely important part in history, and they were tools. They helped people do really quite dangerous things in the past, right? So recognizing that, for me to then see those being sold for such a premium based on the story, and I'm using that with kind of very delicate gloves there because I know what I'm saying, but to use that story, so someone's experience that was probably one of the worst experiences of their life, right? To use that story to then inflate the value of one of these watches that the Dirty Dozen is a part of, that just seems kind of weird to me, if you see what I'm saying.
Interesting, guys. And I think we should stick to the objective, though. Just choose a timeline. Draw the line in the sand like we do with antique, and not overcomplicate things, especially for those that are not knees deep into watch collecting or vintage for that matter, because vintage is very trendy. It has been trendy for quite some time. So let's jump in why I don't think vintage is bullshit. Vintage is cool, was cool, and for foreseeable time will stay cool. And I think we focus too much, especially us watch geeks, on the few that reach crazy record-breaking prices on auctions. But there is so much fun in vintage. I usually recommend youngsters that naturally have that inclination to get into mechanical art, which is old school watchmaking. They just get it. And if even at €1,000 or 1,000 plus for enormous is too much for them, and they don't connect to, let's say, a TSO PRX for just the sake of example, I usually recommend these kids to go out and find an Omega vintage watch, hand wound or even an automatic, or go find amazing Longines vintage watches, just for the sake of getting a feeling for hand wound watches, for the vibe, how they act. They don't need to be scared that they break down or damage them or get water into them. So looking from that angle, I think it's super cool. How fun is it if you love an Omega Speedmaster and you have both a vintage and a modern one? I am an example of that. I have a vintage Navi Timer by Breitling and a modern one. I have an old Monaco by Heuer and a new Monaco by Tag Heuer. It's fun to compare those two, see the evolution. I must say, though, that although I have many vintage watches, I do romanticize it, not even a tiny bit, but a lot, because I love when things are made well and qualitative and have a good quality feel. So I mean, when you click a pusher for a chronograph or wind a movement, or when you turn a bezel, nothing beats modern watches, which is logical because they evolved and they became better in time. And therefore, I love retro-inspired modern watches. That's literally bridging the romantic aspect of vintage watches with the quality of modern times. And I do complain sometimes that I'm fed up with these retro trends, because I mentioned Breitling. Breitling seems to only make retro-inspired watches. They hardly have ultra-modern watches, although in their defense, they made the Bright Light performance watch. I forgot the name for the triathlon athletes. Endurance Pro, that's the name. And they got rid of the aerospace, unfortunately, which is technically also a vintage design because it's an 80s design. So it's very interesting to see, Rob, if you think your aerospace is a vintage design or not, because it's not really that modern anymore. But I can chat for hours. Well, actually, I want to ask you, chaps, did I drive a point why I do think the hypothesis is BS and not vintage being BS?
I think, ultimately, this is not one of those issues where I don't think we're going to convince each other. And I will say, Alan, that it is good advice. Like if someone's trying to get into watches, I think there are some, we'll say like affordable prices in vintage, but I would just sort of counter that and say, but what are you paying for, right? Because if a vintage hand-wound Omega costs, call it between 500 and 700 euros, something like that, right? I could point you to like any number of watches made today with vintage styling that are just objectively better. And I know that's my engineer brain talking. I just want the better watch. So I still think I would just tell people, like, ask yourself, what are you really paying for here? Are you paying for the watch or the word vintage in front of watch? And the second thing I'll say, and Alan, I'm glad you brought it up because I think it is super important, is that it's not just the pricing of the vintage watch themselves. It's really how has it affected the industry as a whole? Because, like I'll throw it back to you guys, like, Rob, for like how much do you think the industry has been set back over the last 10 or 15 years by this huge reliance on vintage reissues in terms of design, right? I mean, where do you think we would be if vintage wasn't such a big deal?
Oh, that's a fascinating question to ask. I think it is a shame that we can't have everything at once. And I think, to be honest, if I'm being optimistic and positive about the current state of affairs, especially post-COVID and the surge of interest in independent brands and this emboldening of smaller brands to try new things, I think we are about to enter a phase where we maybe do have everything that we could possibly want. We don't have the experimental, forward-thinking designs that we saw many times in the 70s and maybe occasionally in the 80s, although they weren't perhaps as timeless as their 70s counterparts had the potential to be. But I do like vintage styling. Like you, David, I don't like crap watches. I don't like things to be broken. I don't like my lume to be patchy or radioactive. I don't like bezels to fall off or not click decisively when you turn them. So I do prefer modern watches. I do lament the apparent inability of most modern watchmakers to take a vintage design and just do it as it was done, but better. There's always some change, always a shift in diameter or an increase in thickness, or this idea that you need to replace a Hesalite Perspex crystal with a sapphire crystal when it's totally unnecessary. If you want to retain the character of the watch, just make it again. What about the original Blancpain Air Command? What was wrong with that? Just completely reissued the goddamn thing. That's what I want. What about the old Submariners with the big crowns? They were lovely. Okay, we see them in the Tudor Black Bay, and I don't think that's any bad thing, but why is there always this necessity to take something that's clearly popular and then try and modernize it in every way rather than the way that we just want people to? However, to your question directly, I think we are about to see smaller brands especially, and smaller brands have never had more power because since the pandemic, more and more independent brands are banding together to create an almost independent group of brands which exhibit together, that visit the same fairs together, that are stocked in the same retailers together, that gives them a protective shield that they never had against the collective power of brands that are part of a massive conglomerate like LVMH, Richemont, or the Swatch Group. So if you visit the kind of fairs that I do as head of brand development for Arcanaut, and you see the kind of brands that are showing with you every single time you go somewhere, you've got Chapek, you've got GOS, you've got brands from the 289 brands like HYT or Bozell, and these people there showing these amazing things. Even brands like Moser and Haute I know they're together, but they're sister brands. They're basically two independents knitted together by one family. But this is a great era because you have the chance to have design and to sort of be protected by your enclave of fellow independents. And if a brand like, say, Arcanaut or Straum or Schofield or Anordain, these are all my favorite brands, as you know, if they are now able to take what they've done with design, which is exceptional and ambitious and pushing the story forward, and in the next couple of years add some serious horology to it, in the process undercutting the established brands that are adding luxury tax on top of luxury tax on top of luxury tax for their name, then we might really enter a golden age of creativity that we've been sorely lacking and desperate for ever since the 1970s, really.
Yeah, and actually, what you said brings to mind a question, which I don't think there's an answer to, but in an imaginary world where Rolex did reissue, millimeter for millimeter, its watch, I think 6538, that's the big crown, right? Would that destroy the market for vintage watches of that type? Because you can get the newer model, right? And if it didn't, does that in fact prove that the price is based on the bullshit, as I call it, right? But I think what you're saying, Rob, too, is interesting because what it implies to me, this ecosystem of newer brands, is that the newer brands have to do this. They have to be creative because they don't have this back catalog. And so the vintage stuff is almost a crutch for the established players, right? And so it does seem like, based on that new paradigm, that it might have held back design in that respect. What do you think about that, Rob?
I think it's more than a crutch because I think that the existing brands that have massive ticket prices for their vintage pieces, like the Big Crown Submariner, for example, are leaving them in the past deliberately because to reissue them millimeter for millimeter, as you said, with modern manufacturing techniques, exactly the same style, would crush the market. Absolutely it would. I don't think that the bullshit would override the ability to buy that beautiful watch for 10 grand if you had them side by side. And, you could buy a new sub Big Crown for 10,000. And to get a sub Big Crown from the 50s would cost you 20 or 30 or 40 or 50,000. But it was beat to hell and it was missing its lume and its bezel was chipped and buggered. Then you'd be crazy to buy the old one. Unless, for example, it was owned by your hero. If it was owned by a famous diver or a famous actor or a famous artist and you really wanted to collect that. But that's not buying the watch for the watch. That's buying the watch as if you'd buy Picasso's hat or, Manet's paintbrushes, or his slippers or whatever. That's something completely other from what we're talking about. In terms of watch collecting, I think that it would destroy that market. I think that's probably why they don't do it. And I think that's a real shame.
Alan, question for you as a retailer. I mean, we're sort of talking about different things. We're talking about performance and looks, heritage. I mean, when your customers, for the most part, come into your store, do they care about anything other than the performance and the looks? Or, I mean, does this idea of a story and heritage come into play?
So I think we should take into consideration status. I mean, vintage gives you not so much status maybe, but a factor of coolness, right? I don't like the term hipster, but for the sake of marketing purposes and demographics, let's use it. So it adds to your identity and style. That's something that's taken into consideration. And it's ironic that very young people want a specific product from a specific era. And you also see cyclical behavior. You see that in fashion as well, right? So I've been collecting Nike Air Jordan 1s actually since the 80s. But you see youngsters as old as 6 years old even wearing them. And you'll see it in denim trends. And sometimes you'll see it in watches because we're going back to dress watches. We saw that trend with, for example, Clues and Daniel Wellington, where they took basically either Patek Calatrava and put it on a regular strap or a NATO strap or other dress watches. So I find those interesting trends. Some people would like to hear the story, as you mentioned, David, if we know the history behind a piece. So what has it been through? I've said this many times on air. I don't like the fact that watches are being commoditized. So often people want to know if the papers and boxes and etc. more for the resale value than that they holistically want to know what's the real story behind the watch. What do you think, Rob?
Well, I think that to the point of commoditization, we might actually be coming out of the back end of that now. And we're seeing vintage or secondhand watches start to dip in price. And this is a good thing because an old watch should cost less than a new watch. That's like the natural cycle of things when there isn't this incredible inflated idea of what cool is. But there's a couple of things I want to say before I shut up. One of them is I like watches from the past that cannot be made anymore. So that's the only kind of, if we want vintage or even antique watch that I would buy. And what I mean by watches that cannot be made anymore are products that come from maybe regions that no longer exist, like, for example, the Soviet Union. I quite enjoy buying the old watches that have either USSR or CCCP on the dial, because I find that a time capsule. That's not the same to me as buying a knackered Breitling Avi or whatever when there's a brand new reissue that is exactly the same. I'd get the new one if I wanted that style. But I'm talking like the old like Polyot stuff, the stuff that you just can't get anymore. And if you can find some of those old pieces, rubbish as they are in so many ways, in new old stock condition, then I think, okay, that's cool. That's the kind of thing I would buy. I'd chuck $100 on that because I think, well, this is never going to be made again. This cannot be repeated. Something from Waltham or Hamilton when it was based in the US. Maybe a Hamilton electronic watch. I had one once. It didn't work. The electronic movement was knackered. It couldn't be fixed. And so I ripped it out and stuck a quartz movement in there, put some new hands on it and gave it to my sister. She wears it. She loves it. She doesn't know any different. But I can see why people would buy that kind of thing. That kind of thing is cool. When technology existed for a moment and it no longer exists, that's a real museum piece. So that's okay. And I enjoy that. But the other thing that's come to mind is that I always say this, and I'll just say this once and let you guys chew it over. Better isn't always better, right? We've talked about this in terms of material choices. For example, a ceramic bezel is theoretically, and I say this in very bold inverted commas, better than an aluminium insert bezel for many reasons, like color fastness, hardness, scratch resistance, so on and so forth. but does it look as cool? Does it have the same emotional value? Does it take you to the place mentally that you want to be taken to? I don't know if it does. I always find them a bit sterile. I always find them a bit lab grown, and that upsets me. So there are some elements of vintage watches which are rarely carried over to modern redesigns because they are seen as inferior. But I think emotionally they have currency that we should not ignore. David?
Yeah, I think, that brings me to the last point I made in the article, and probably the last point I'd need to make today, which both you and Alan touched on, right? Is this whole idea of story that's used to sell vintage watches. I don't want to buy someone else's story. I mentioned in the article that if somehow I were able to get my hands on Jay-Z's Tiffany Patek, that doesn't make me Jay-Z. Like, I'll never be Jay-Z. I'll never be as cool as him, right? So I don't want to buy someone else's story. That's not interesting to me. But to your point, Rob, I totally understand why someone might appreciate the qualities of aluminum relative to ceramic, as long as that's a canvas for their story. I don't want to buy an aluminum watch whose story has been written by someone else and the watch is already worn out. If I buy an aluminum bezel, it's because I'm going to put all my adventures on that and go forward. And if my watch is worth nothing at the end of it, then cool. I still got to live in it. I'd much rather do that than pay 20, 30, 40, 50 times what the watch is worth because I'm buying someone else's story.
I agree with Rob about better is not always better. And what comes to mind is a Rolex GMT Master. We had an in-depth product review and discussion about why I love my aluminum bezeled one way more than the ceramic and why I let go of the ceramic. So I'm with you, Rob. And it's actually interesting, David, what you said about you don't want to buy somebody else's story and how you took it to your beloved Patek Tiffany 5711. I was laughing. So yeah, interesting, very interesting. So let's throw a curveball. Do you own a vintage watch, David? And well, I know the answer, Rob, but for the sake of our new listeners, I'll ask you as well.
So real quick, full disclosure, I own one which would be vintage based on your definition, Alan. So that's my father's, the watch I inherited. And there was a time, a couple of years back, when I did dabble in French vintage watches. So Rob, to your point, that's not something that's made anymore. But I quickly retired of that because I was like, these are just not, they're cool. They're part of history, but they're just not very well made. And my money would go better elsewhere. So short answer is currently at the moment, I own one.
Do I have vintage watches? Yes, I have a few, I suppose, that fall into that categorization, older than 25 years. I've got Omega's, one that is from 98. I've got one from, I think, the mid-70s, as well, a Speedmaster. Oh, I don't know. I've got a couple of Kienzler hand-wound pieces that I picked up at thrift shops and serviced and brought back to life myself. They're from, I think, the 60s. And they're 31mm pieces that I have on Forstner mesh bracelets, and they're lovely. I like to wear them whenever I'm dressed a bit like a German Opa. And what else do I have? Oh, I don't know. Bits and bobs. Not too many, though. And to be quite frank, I'm probably going to move on from most of them. I'll keep the Kienzlers because they're worth absolutely nothing. And I love them. And they add a nice little wrinkle to my wardrobe when I need it. But ultimately, I'm kind of moving towards buying the pieces from the makers that I really respect now. I'd rather put my money in the hands of new, inspiring guys that are doing things that I believe in, like the brands I mentioned before, like Schofield, like Straum, like Arcanaut, like Anordain. These are the brands that really excite me. I like the new modern stuff from Fortis. I love the history of Fortis, but I'm not so into the old watches. I like the new stuff that's been created since Jupp Philippe took over. I think that's really cool. And that sort of brand should get my cash, and I should put it into projects like Sylvain Bernerand's project with the Mirage. Now, that's going to cost an awful lot of my watches to buy into that, but it would be worth it if I could ever afford to, because these are the people I believe in, and these are the people I believe are driving the conversation forward, and forwards is always better. Okay, so let's wrap it up there. I think the general consensus is that there is no general consensus here. We'd love to hear what you, our listeners, think about this topic. We know some of you love vintage watches. We know some of you hate them. We'd love to hear your definitions. The best way to let us know about those is either to contact us via Instagram. I'm there at RobNuds, ROBNUDDS. Alon is there at ALONBENJOSEPH. and David can be found at DAVAUCHER. Our emails, either Rob or Alon at therealtime.show, or via the contact form on the website, which can be found at www.therealtime.show. If you'd like to really dig into this conversation with us, you can join the Real Time Show Network, which is our WhatsApp community. There are many channels within the community, so you don't have to subscribe to every channel if not everything that we talk about is of interest to you. But if you'd like to join, simply send us a note on one of those aforementioned mediums, and we will get you into that group post haste. Finally, please like and follow and subscribe to the podcast. And the reason why we ask you to subscribe to the podcast is because whenever we approach brands and ask them to come on the show, they like to know how many subscribers we have. So we'd like to be able to furnish them with a very healthy number. And if you have time, please leave us a 5-star review and a nice little comment, because that makes all of the hard work that goes into recording the Real Time Show a lot of fun. We'll be back next week with another Q&A session and an interview from one of watchmaking's finest. Until then, stay safe and keep on ticking.